The ancient historian Homer speaks of the dyeing of red and purple cloth as characteristic of the city, and this cloth was sold worldwide. You may remember reading in Acts 16, a woman, Lydia. She was a seller of purple. She was from the city Thyatira. When she was converted to Christianity, she took Christianity back to Thyatira and began the church there. Interesting, huh? It's also significant that during the Thyatira, or the Middle Ages period of church history, clergymen began to wear these scarlet and purple robes. This is also confirmed later in Revelation chapter 17, verse 4, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked in gold and precious stones and pearls, having the golden cup full of abominations and filthiness in her fornication. So we see the parallel here. You see the little hats they have on? What's it look like?
Dagon.
Dagon. Right. Dagon was the pagan fish god of the Philistines. Remember that? They took the Ark of God and they set it at the altar there in the Philistines, and when they came in the morning, Dagon had fallen over and cracked his hand off. And remember that? Well, that was the fish god, Dagon. And the priests of Dagon would wear this garb that had a head of a fish, that was, the mouth was gaping open, like that, and then it had tails that came down the back, and you can see here in this illustration. Well, guess what? I just find it curious that these sort of things are adopted. We're not picking on anybody. We're not condemning the Catholic Church. We're not condemning any individual. But we have to look at history. And when we look at history, we say, why did they do that? Why did they do that? Rick?
Also look at the solar emblem on the front.
That's right. That's right. And on his little staff there, right where his hand is, you see a little pine cone. Pine cone is a symbol of eternal life. Comes from the evergreen tree. This goes back to Nimrod and Semiramis. Nimrod was murdered. Semiramis said he wasn't murdered. He was buried, and the evergreen tree that was sprouted next to him became a symbol of eternal life. Semiramis later became pregnant. She said that she was having child by the resurrected Nimrod. The child that was born, she called Tammuz. Remember there in Ezekiel, you know, the women were crying and sighing to Tammuz? Well, it's this God that they were sighing and crying to in the temple of God. Tammuz was born on December 25th. December 25th is the day that sun worshippers were finally able to see that the dying sun that had been dying, the day's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. When's the winter solstice? December 21st. It took 4 more days before they could say the day lasted longer. So December 25th became the birth of the sun, because they could say, yes, sun is lasting longer now. It's regained its power. Well, Tammuz, interestingly enough, was born on December 21st. We see from this one story of Nimrod and Semiramis, we get many errors that have crept into the church. We get the error of natural immortality of the soul, because Semiramis said Nimrod didn't die. We get Christmas and the Christmas tree. We get a virgin. You know, Semiramis wasn't supposed to have a husband. He was gone. But this virgin conceived a child. All this came down through ancient Babylon and has found its way into the Christian church. And we accept it without thought. Thyatira lasted a long time. And during this period, there was a great deal of backsliding. Spiritually, educationally, people lost the ability to read. The average person had no education whatsoever. The only way that you got an education was if you decided you wanted to be a priest, and then they'd send you to school. During this time, too, there was a major plague that came through killed millions of people. Half the population of Europe died to bubonic plague during this time period. That's incredible. But it was because of superstition that all this was to take place. You know, I mean, it's also a punishment, I believe, that these millions of people were killed. There was 75 million people, estimated 75 million people in Europe died from the bubonic plague. The papacy forsook the true Sabbath of Jehovah, and in its place put Sunday. The memorial of creation is Sabbath. It's also a memorial of Christ's finished work as our sacrifice. You ever wonder why Christ didn't rise the very next day after he was crucified? Why did he wait till Sunday? Well, there's two reasons. He rested on the Sabbath day. But Sunday, the first day of the week, was also the day when they offered the wave sheaf, which we studied about last time. So, yes, but Sabbath, he rested. In place of the true Sabbath, the papal system has adopted the Sun's Day, or Sunday, as the day of worship. This is Monsignor Ségur, and he says, very interestingly, the observance of Sunday by the Protestants is an homage they pay, in spite of themselves, to the authority of the Catholic Church. This is another quote from a man named James Freeman Clarke. This book was written in 1889. Like I said, I use old history books. They're more accurate. And James Freeman Clarke says, it has not always been sufficiently considered how much the Latin Church was a reproduction on a higher plane, this exalting, remember, of the Roman Commonwealth. The resemblance between the Roman Catholic ceremonies and those of pagan Rome have often been noticed. The Roman Catholic Church has borrowed from paganism saints' days, incense, lustrations, consecrations of sacred places, votive offerings, relics, winking, nodding, sweating, and bleeding images, holy water, vestments, etc. But the Church of Rome itself, in the central idea of authority, is a reproduction of the Roman state religion, which was a part of the Roman state. It was a resurrection of Rome, Roman ideas rising to a higher life. The Roman Catholic Church at first was an aristocratic republic, like the Roman state. It afterward became, like the Roman state, a disguised despotism. The papal church is therefore a legacy of ancient Rome. Church and state are only united under pagan systems. Unfaithfulness to God is called fornication because throughout the Scriptures, the covenant relation between God and his people is represented by marriage. Christ calls himself the bridegroom and his church the bride. Any transgression, therefore, would constitute the form of spiritual adultery. So the terms harlotry, fornication would be especially true of a church that united itself in any form with paganism. So God's church uniting itself with a political state is a form of spiritual adultery. In all the history of the world, there has been no more applicable representation of the fallen church than Jezebel, who united herself with the people of God through an illicit marriage to Ahab, and then brought all of her paganism, assumed the leadership position not only of the church, but the state, demanding Ahab do her bidding in every instance. Under Jezebel, a weak and faithless Judaism was joined by a vigorous paganism. Satan has never slacked off on what he does, not the least little bit. God's church gets lazy. God's people say, well, I'm doing so much, isn't that enough? Satan never slacks off. So just as we saw Jezebel bring in paganism because Judaism had gotten lax, we see the same thing during the age of Thyatira. Christianity got lax, and paganism took over. And like I said earlier, Jezebel lasted for 3.5 years. And the Thyatira church also has a 3.5 prophetic year term. The promise of the morning star to this church indicates that the end of the period of darkness would be renewed by truths of the Bible. Just as there was a revival under Elijah, and Jehu, God attempted to bring to his Christian church reform and truth. He promised